We want to talk about someone else as well, because we want to turn our attention now to Attorney General Eric Holder, who was also in San Francisco this week. He sparked much debate when he announced sweeping new changes in minimum sentencing policies. Holder directed his U.S. attorneys across the country to stop charging low-level, nonviolent drug offenders with offenses that carry severe mandatory sentences.
In 2010 alone. Incarceration has a significant role to play in our justice system. Widespread incarceration at the federal, state, and local levels is both ineffective and unsustainable.
So, Carla, let's go back to you. But, Michael, I want to invite you to join the conversation, too, because you've been covering criminal justice issues for a long time. But what Eric Holder announced, how significant is this federal shift that he's talking about?
Well, I think he opened a national conversation when he called the justice system shameful. In that studies show that black males as a whole have sentences 20% longer than white males. And what he did was direct 94 U.S. attorneys to be more flexible in their sentencing when it comes to these low-level nonviolent drug offenders. I think that's significant, but, you know, as Michael knows, there's a lot of debate about how effective this could be. It was opening a conversation that was very, very important. A lot of people thought that was significant, especially since the prison population has grown 800% since 1980. Overcrowding is a major issue he's trying to address here.
Are there parallels? I mean, overcrowding in federal prisons, but definitely overcrowding is a huge problem in California's prisons.
I mean, that's right.
Well.
And who's channeling whom? Is Holder channeling Jerry Brown or Jerry Brown channeling Holder? And that is, they have a problem, or we have a problem as a society, and that is really full, overfull prisons. What Holder's saying, what the Attorney General is saying is, we have to create more flexibility in the system. There's got to be more discretion in terms of some of these cases, and that's essentially what he's doing. He's not changing any laws. He can't. Congress might be able to do that, and there's been some criticism. Some critics of his speech are saying that this should be left to Congress to take care of, not the Attorney General. But the problem here is, how do you get there? Governor Brown launched this realignment program that is diverting low-level offenders to counties, hopefully so that they'll be handled differently, alternatives perhaps not being locked up. In some senses, that's what Holder is trying to, I think, accomplish. That is, get people to think, how should we deal with people who might be drug addicts committing crimes to get more money for drugs, but who aren't perhaps dangerous people.
Well, Michael, I think that's a key question, is that if not hard time, then what? Because if we want to start using more alternative programs than sending them to jail, I guess the question is, well, what programs? Are they out there and ramped up?
Right. So one of the themes here is, we're in some ways, in some states, and perhaps the Attorney General is recommending that we start looking at this get tough era, these 30 years of laws and sentence enhancements. And some experts will say what's different between now and 20 years ago is we have alternatives. There's proven alternatives for low-level drug offenders. You don't need to incarcerate them. And in fact, it's cheaper and more effective, and the recidivism rates are actually lower. We've seen that in states like Texas and Oklahoma. In fact, the federal government's sort of behind the curve, as is California. That's at least what a lot of experts say.
Well, because California passed Prop 36 recently. That's another example of how states have been taking the lead on this. And then Prop 36 basically said for the third strike to happen, it has to be for a serious crime. I'm wondering, though, with what Holder announced, is there bipartisan support in Washington for something like this?
I mean, yeah, we are seeing that. I think and Michael, I'd like to hear your thoughts. I mean, in terms of a cultural shift here, it was not too long ago that Californians and across the country, people were saying, like, throw away the key, 3 strikes, you're out. Now people are starting to look at the prison system and some of the injustices, which, Holder called shameful, and realizing there are some huge inequities and a lot of lives being affected when you talk about throwing away the key on 20-year-old men. And we've written a number of things about it. Case of Clarence Aaron, a young man, 23, who was sentenced to life without parole for the first nonviolent drug offense, a $1,500 drug deal. Now, serial killers, don't spend that much time in prison. Oftentimes, that kind of case, I think, is what Holder's talking about.
There's going to be a continuing debate about how you define a low-level low-level offender. We didn't hear that from the Attorney General, and we didn't get a lot of details from him. We expect to hear more soon on that.
Okay, and while we wait for that, we also want to talk about another situation going on in the criminal justice system in California, and that's the hunger strike by California prisoners. It's now in its 6th week, and there doesn't seem to be a resolution in sight. Supporters of the hunger strikers have demanded changes in how prisoners are treated in solitary confinement. Advocates for the inmates say conditions are inhumane. The state's corrections chief contends the strike is controlled by violent prison gangs. Now, Michael, you've been on this program before talking about this issue. We're revisiting it today because there were developments today. There was a settlement conference in the lawsuit involving Pelican Bay. Talk about that.
Right. So we're on the 38th day of the hunger strike, where I think 98 inmates have not been eating for 38 days. That's pretty far in.
It's
much longer than the last hunger strike in 2011. Parallel with the hunger strike, there's this federal lawsuit focusing on Pelican Bay, focusing on conditions there, claiming that these conditions are unconstitutional. There have been settlement talks ordered by the federal judge in the case. There seems to be some progress there, perhaps not a breakthrough, but the feeling is that if there is a settlement between the inmates and their lawyers and the state on the federal lawsuit, that might get the hunger strike leaders to call off the protest.
You know, I'm wondering, some of the prisoners involved are some very bad guys. We know that. And what have they accomplished when it comes to changing public opinion on it? Has public opinion, are they on? Is the public on their side? Has the needle moved at all?
I mean, very hard to win public sympathy on something like this.
There are some really bad actors among these, some of the.
We're talking rapists, murderers.
It's worth keeping in mind. So Pelican Bay, the units that are an issue here are these security housing units. They're prisons within the prison system. So men are not sentenced there. They're sent there for reasons determined by the prison system. So it's true that many of these inmates are convicted of murder, for example. They're placed in these units largely on allegations that they're gang members, prison gang members. And indeed, last week we had an indictment concerning the Mexican mafia and drug cartels going in cahoots to control trafficking in Los Angeles.
While they're in this,
one of the men
security.
in one of the indictments is one of the hunger strike leaders. There's no doubt that there's some serious allegations. On the other hand, as we've reported, there are low-level offenders, 3 striker types who've ended up in Pelican Bay for years, trapped in a sort of Kafkaesque system that they can't get out of. So you have a wide spectrum of
Michael,
offenders there.
I've got to ask you this, because you've been up there. You've been up to Pelican Bay. You know that throughout this entire controversy, the state has been saying again and again, we don't have solitary confinement. Well, you've been there, do they?
Well, so the allegation from the side of the hunger strikers and the lawsuit that Pelican Bay really is long-term solitary confinement and that it's torture, and they throw out some international conventions supporting that. I've been there. I would never want to be locked there. Whether it constitutes solitary confinement, there's simply no consensus on that. There's no legal definition of solitary. Some of the inmates are double-celled. So they have cellmates.
Okay.
So they're
Some.
Do they have access to the outside world?
They
TV,
don't. So the issue, they have
visits?
televisions. They do get visitors behind glass, but their everyday life, they're in their cells 22 and a half hours a day. The hour and a half that they're out, they're in a concrete room essentially. So they don't really see the outside world except on this tiny.
It's
television.
isolation.
I would
Essential.
argue it's isolation. Whether it's solitary confinement, I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it looks like the civil disobedience may not be the best recourse at this point. There seems to be very little public pressure to do something about it, so it may have to hinge on what happens in the Pelican Bay suit.
Correct. I think that a lot rides on this lawsuit and being settled. And in the meantime, you have some men in very vulnerable medical situations. There could be, they're vulnerable to heart attacks and all sorts of things. We haven't seen any emergencies yet, but I think we're getting into that moment when that could very much happen.
Okay, I know you'll watch it. Michael, thank you.